The diplomatic vessel Horizon moved slowly through the darkness of space as it approached the massive structure that hung in orbit above Kavros Prime. Ambassador Richard Hayes stood near the observation window and watched the Galaxy Council station grow larger with each passing moment. The station was enormous and shaped like a ring with thousands of lights glowing from its surface. Ships from hundreds of different worlds docked along its outer edges, and the whole thing spun slowly to create artificial gravity for the species that needed it. Richard had made this journey many times over the past 20 years, but today felt different. Today he carried with him the weight of every human who had ever felt the sting of the Council's contempt. Beside him stood Colonel Lisa Morgan, her uniform crisp and her expression unreadable. She was a military advisor, but everyone knew she was really here to assess threats. On his other side was Dr. Paul Grant, a scientist who had spent 15 years trying to get the Council to share advanced technologies with Earth. All three of them knew that this meeting would change everything. The Horizon docked with a soft thud that echoed through the hull, and within minutes they were walking through the corridors of the station. Aliens of every shape and size moved past them, and some glanced at the humans with curiosity, while others ignored them completely. Richard had long ago stopped being amazed by the diversity of life in the galaxy. Now he only saw the political reality behind it all. The strong species controlled everything, while the weak ones begged for scraps. They entered the council chamber, and Richard felt the familiar weight of judgment pressing down on him. The chamber was a vast circular room with seating arranged in ascending tiers. Representatives from over 400 worlds sat in their designated spots, and at the center was the speaking floor where petitioners had to stand and make their cases. Above it all sat the council speaker, a being called Thelnix who belonged to one of the founding species. Thelnix had pale blue skin and 4 arms and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Richard walked to the speaking floor, and Lisa and Paul took their positions behind him. The chamber grew quiet, and Thelnix's voice filled the space with a tone that managed to sound both bored and annoyed at the same time. The council would now hear the human petition regarding the territorial dispute over the colony world of New Terra. Richard began to speak, and his voice was steady, despite the anger he felt building inside. He explained that humans had settled New Terra 12 years ago, after following all proper protocols and filing all required documentation. They had invested billions of credits and thousands of lives into building a thriving colony. The soil had been tested and cities had been built and children had been born under that alien sky. New Terra was as much a part of humanity now as Earth itself, but 3 months ago the Valorian Empire had filed a claim against New Terra, and they cited some ancient territorial charter that supposedly gave them rights to that entire region of space. Richard presented evidence that the charter had been written over 1,000 years ago, and that the Valorians had never actually settled or even surveyed New Terra before humans arrived. He showed records and testimonies and legal arguments that any fair court would find compelling. The Valorians had their turn to speak, and their representative was a tall being covered in dark scales, with eyes that glowed a faint red. The Valorians spoke of honor and ancient rights and the importance of respecting historical claims. They argued that human expansion had been too aggressive and that younger species needed to learn patience. They suggested that humans should be grateful for any worlds the Council allowed them to keep. Richard watched the faces of the Council members as both sides presented their cases, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Most of them looked disinterested, and some were clearly already decided. This was not a trial or a negotiation. This was a formality before a predetermined outcome. Thelnix called for the council to vote, and the process took less than 5 minutes. When it was done, the speaker announced that the council had ruled in favor of the Valorian Empire. New Terra would be transferred to Valorian control within 6 standard months, and all human settlers would be required to evacuate. There would be no compensation, and no alternative colony site offered. The decision was final. Richard stood very still as the words washed over him. Behind him, he heard Lisa take a sharp breath, and Paul muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. Around the chamber, some representatives looked uncomfortable, while others seemed satisfied. The Valorian representative made a gesture that Richard assumed was their version of a smile. For 20 years, Richard had played by the rules, and he had been patient and diplomatic and respectful. He had swallowed his pride and accepted restrictions on human trade and limits on human expansion, and countless small humiliations. He had done all of this because he believed that eventually the Council would see humanity as equals. But standing here now in this chamber with 400 species watching his world lose everything it had built, he finally understood the truth. The Galaxy Council would never see humans as equals, and no amount of patience or diplomacy would change that. The Council was not a democratic institution or a fair arbiter. It was a power structure designed to keep the strong species strong and the weak species weak. Earth had been naive to think otherwise. Richard raised his hand and asked to speak again, and Thelnix looked annoyed but granted permission. Richard walked back to the center of the speaking floor, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. He thanked the Council for making their position clear, and he said that humanity had learned an important lesson today. Then he delivered the words that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. Effective immediately, humanity was withdrawing from the Galaxy Council, and Earth would no longer recognize Council authority over human affairs or human territory. All treaties and agreements between Earth and the Council were hereby void. Humanity would chart its own course from this moment forward. The chamber erupted into chaos, and representatives began shouting and demanding explanations. Thelnix stood from the speaker's chair and commanded Richard to retract his statement. The Valorian representative was on his feet and making threats, but Richard simply turned and walked toward the exit with Lisa and Paul, following close behind. They made it back to the horizon without incident, and as soon as the docking clamps released, Lisa ordered the pilot to get them out of there. The ship turned and accelerated away from the station, and Richard watched through the window as the Galaxy Council grew smaller behind them. He had just done something that no species had done in 3,000 years of Council history. He had said no, and now everything would change. The emergency session had been called within hours of Ambassador Richard Hayes returning to Earth, and now the most powerful people on the planet sat around a table in Geneva, trying to understand what came next. President Karen Phillips sat at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her. She had been in office for 3 years, and nothing in her political career had prepared her for this moment. To her right was General Nathan Price, the head of Earth Defense Forces, and to her left was Admiral Claire Johnson, who commanded the human fleet. Around the table sat prime ministers and corporate leaders and scientists and military advisors from every major nation on Earth. Richard Hayes stood before them and delivered his report. He explained the Council's ruling on New Terra and the systematic discrimination humanity had faced for 2 decades. He described the contempt in Thelnix's voice and the satisfaction on the Valorian representative's face. He told them about the moment he had decided that enough was enough. When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment. The debate that followed was intense, and voices were raised and fists were pounded on the table. Some argued that leaving the Council was suicide and that Earth would be isolated and vulnerable. Others said that humanity had no choice and that staying in the Council would mean accepting permanent second-class status. President Phillips let them argue for almost an hour before she finally called for order. General Nathan Price stood and activated a holographic display that showed the current state of Earth's defenses. The numbers were not encouraging. Humanity had 12 major warships and maybe 40 smaller vessels spread across 3 colony worlds. The Council had thousands of ships at its disposal, and any one of the major powers could probably defeat Earth in a direct conflict. If the Council decided to make an example of humanity, there was not much Earth could do to stop them. But then Admiral Claire Johnson stood, and the mood in the room shifted. She had been waiting for this moment, and now she revealed what her team had been working on in secret for the past 10 years. Project Nexus was a defensive network of satellites positioned around Earth and all human colonies. Each satellite was equipped with weapons based on theoretical physics that the Council had banned decades ago, because they considered the technology too dangerous. The weapons used focused energy beams that could cut through standard Council shields like they were made of paper. The hologram changed to show the satellite network, and the coverage was impressive. Any ship approaching Earth or the colonies would have to pass through multiple defensive zones. Admiral Johnson explained that the system had been tested in secret, and it worked better than anyone had hoped. Earth might not be able to project power across the galaxy, but it could defend its own territory against anything short of a full-scale invasion by multiple Council powers working Together, the room began to buzz with new energy, and President Phillips allowed herself a small smile. But the question of defense was only one part of the problem. Earth's economy depended on trade through the Council's jump gate network, and without access to those gates, humanity would be cut off from most of the galaxy. Several corporate leaders pointed this out, and their concern was obvious in their voices. That was when Marcus Lee spoke up. He was young for someone in this room, barely 40 years old, but he had built the most successful technology company in human space. His company had been researching faster than light travel for years, and now he had something to show them. The hologram changed again, and this time it displayed a ship design unlike anything Earth currently used. Marcus explained that his team had developed a prototype drive system that did not require jump gates. The Council used gates because that was how their ancestors had done it, and because gates allowed them to control who went where. But humanity had approached the problem differently. The new drive created its own temporary gateway by manipulating space-time in a localized field around the ship. It was dangerous and expensive, and the calculations required were incredibly complex. But it worked. The prototype ship had made 3 successful jumps in the last month, and each time it had traveled further than the last. Marcus believed that with proper funding and resources, they could have production models ready within a year. Earth would not need the Council's jump gates anymore. Humanity could go anywhere it wanted. President Phillips looked around the table and saw hope replacing fear on the faces of the people gathered there. The pieces were falling into place. Earth could defend itself, and it could travel independently, and it had resources that other species wanted. Maybe leaving the Council was not suicide after all. Maybe it was an opportunity. She called for a vote, and the decision was unanimous. Earth would not only leave the Council, but would defend its interests with force if necessary. All human worlds would be fortified, and the fleet would be expanded as quickly as possible. The satellite defense network would be activated and placed on high alert. And most importantly, Earth would reach out to other species who might be interested in trading outside the Council's control. President Phillips composed a message to be sent to the Galaxy Council. The message was polite but firm. Earth respected the Council's authority over its own members, but humanity was no longer a member. Any attempt by Council forces to enter human space without permission would be considered an act of war. Human ships would continue to travel freely throughout the galaxy, and Earth expected its citizens and vessels to be treated with the same respect given to any sovereign power. The message was sent, and then everyone in the room waited for the response. It came 6 hours later, and it was exactly what they had expected. The Galaxy Council declared an embargo on all human worlds and revoked humanity's access to the Jump Gate network. All human vessels currently using Council stations were given 48 hours to leave Council space. Any human ship found in Council territory after that deadline would be impounded and its crew detained. The Council clearly expected this to bring Earth to its knees within months. They believed that isolation would force humanity to come back and beg for readmission. They thought humans would accept whatever terms the Council offered just to survive, but the Council had made a fundamental mistake. They had assumed that humans would react the way other species had reacted in the past. They did not understand that humanity had been preparing for this moment even before they consciously knew it was coming. General Nathan Price immediately ordered all human vessels to return to human space, and the recall went out across every communication channel. Admiral Claire Johnson activated the Nexus Defense Network, and satellites that had been dormant for years suddenly came online around Earth and New Terra and the other colonies. Marcus Lee's company began converting its facilities to produce the new jump drives, and he promised the first batch would be ready in 3 months, instead of a year. President Phillips addressed the people of Earth in a broadcast that was watched by billions. She explained what had happened and why the decision had been made. She told them that the months ahead would be difficult and that there might be conflict and sacrifice. But she also told them that humanity would not bow to anyone and that every human being had the right to stand tall and be treated with dignity. The speech was simple and direct, and it resonated with people across the planet. Over the next few days, messages began arriving from unexpected sources. Small trading companies that operated on the fringes of Council space reached out to ask if Earth was interested in doing business. Independent colonies that had no love for the Council sent quiet expressions of support. A few species that had their own grievances against the Council contacted human diplomats to suggest secret meetings. The galaxy was much bigger than the Council, and not everyone was happy with the way things had been run for the past 3,000 years. Earth had taken the first step into an unknown future, and now there was no turning. Back 3 months had passed since Earth withdrew from the Galaxy Council, and Captain Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the EDF Vanguard watching the stars shift and blur as his ship made its first independent jump. The sensation was different from traveling through a council gate, and it felt more raw and immediate. The new drive system hummed with power beneath his feet, and when the jump completed, he found himself staring at a binary star system that no human ship had visited in over a year. The Vanguard was one of the first vessels equipped with the new technology, and Daniel had been chosen to command it because of his experience and his reputation for keeping a cool head in difficult situations. His crew was small but highly skilled, and they had spent the past month testing the new systems and learning how to navigate without relying on the Council's infrastructure. Now they had a mission that could change everything for humanity. Daniel ordered his communications officer, Lieutenant Jake Morris, to send out a general hailing signal. They were looking for the Kalari, a species of traders who operated on the fringes of Council space and who had a reputation for dealing with anyone who had credits to spend. The Council tolerated the Kalari because they were useful and because they stayed out of politics. But the Kalari also had no loyalty to the Council, and that made them perfect for what Daniel had in mind. It took almost an hour, but eventually a response came through. A Kalari trading ship decloaked about 50 kilometers away, and Daniel had to admire their caution. The Kalari vessel was smaller than the Vanguard, but it bristled with weapons and sensor arrays. A voice came through the communication system speaking in heavily accented but understandable English. The Kalari captain wanted to know what a human ship was doing so far from human space. Daniel smiled and told his helmsman to move the Vanguard closer, but not threateningly so. He opened a channel and introduced himself, and explained that Earth was looking to establish new trading relationships. The Kalari captain was silent for a moment, and then asked if it was true that humans had left the Galaxy Council. Daniel confirmed it, and he could hear the surprise in the Kalari captain's voice when the reply came back. Within minutes, Daniel found himself in a holographic conference with the Kalari captain, whose name was difficult for human tongues to pronounce, but who told Daniel to call him Vec. The Kalari looked vaguely reptilian with smooth green skin and large eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Vec studied Daniel carefully and asked why Earth thought the Kalari would risk angering the Council by trading with humans. Daniel had prepared for this question, and he laid out his proposal with confidence. Earth could manufacture goods that were now unavailable through Council channels because of the embargo. Human technology was different from Council technology, and that meant it filled gaps in the market. Earth had medical supplies and computer systems and weapons that worked on principles the Council had never fully explored. The Kalari could buy these goods from Earth and sell them to their own customers at a significant profit. Everyone would benefit. Vec listened, and his expression was unreadable. He asked what Earth wanted in return, and Daniel told him the truth. Humanity needed raw materials and information about which other species might be interested in trading outside the Council's control. The Kalari had contacts throughout the galaxy, and they heard things that official channels missed. That information was valuable, and Earth was willing to pay for it. The negotiation lasted for 3 hours, and by the end of it, Daniel had his first trade agreement. The Kalari would purchase human goods on a trial basis, and if the quality was acceptable, they would expand the relationship. Vec also agreed to share information about other independent traders and colonies that might be receptive to hum and contact. As the hologram faded, Vec made a comment that stuck with Daniel. He said that the Kalari had been waiting a long time for someone to challenge the Council's dominance, and it was interesting that humans were the ones to finally do it. Over the next few weeks, word spread through the galactic underground faster than Daniel had expected. The Kalari were apparently good at spreading news, and suddenly the Vanguard was receiving messages from dozens of sources. Independent colonies wanted to buy human technology, and small trading companies wanted to establish supply lines, and even a few minor species that belonged to the Council reached out through secret channels. The embargo that was supposed to isolate Earth was instead creating opportunities. Daniel reported everything back to Admiral Claire Johnson, and she authorized him to make more deals. The Vanguard traveled from system to system, and at each stop Daniel found someone willing to do business with humanity. Earth's economy, which everyone had predicted would collapse, began to grow instead. Human factories ran at full capacity to meet the demand, and new jobs were created, and President Karen Phillips gave speeches about how humanity was proving it could thrive without the Council, but not everyone was happy about Earth's success. The Valorian Empire watched with growing anger as humans continued to defy the Council's will. The Valorians had expected Earth to surrender New Terra without a fight, and they had expected the embargo to force humanity back into submission. Instead, humans were becoming more independent and more confident with each passing day. The Valorian High Command decided that an example needed to be made. Daniel was halfway back to Earth when he received an urgent message from New Terra. A Valorian battle fleet had entered the system and was demanding the immediate evacuation of all human colonists. The Valorians claimed they were enforcing the Council's ruling, and they gave the humans 48 hours to comply. After that, they would begin orbital bombardment to clear the planet for Valorian settlement. Daniel knew the Vanguard could reach New Terra in 30 hours if he pushed the new drive to its limits. He also knew he would be outnumbered and outgunned when he got there. The Valorian fleet consisted of 30 warships according to the initial reports, and Daniel had only his own ship, plus 4 other human vessels that were stationed at New Terra for routine patrol. The odds were terrible, but there was never any question about what he would do. He ordered his crew to prepare for combat and set course for New Terra at maximum speed. Lieutenant Jake Morris asked if they should wait for reinforcements, but Daniel shook his head. If they waited, the Valorians would start their attack, and the colonists on the ground would be defenseless. Commander Sophie Turner led the defense forces on New Terra, and Daniel had served with her years ago. He knew she would never order an evacuation, even if it meant certain death. The people of New Terra had built that world with their own hands, and they would defend it with their lives. The Vanguard jumped into the New Terra system exactly 29 hours after receiving the distress call, and what Daniel saw made his blood run cold. The Valorian fleet was arranged in standard attack formation around the planet, and their weapons were already charging. On the surface, Commander Sophie Turner had activated every defensive installation the colony possessed, but everyone knew it would not be enough to stop an orbital bombardment. The Valorian commander sent a message demanding to know why a human ship had entered the system. Daniel took a deep breath and opened a channel that broadcast to every ship in the area. His voice was calm and steady when he spoke. He told the Valorians that New Terra was human territory and that they needed to leave immediately. If they chose to attack, they would face the consequences. There was a moment of silence, and then the Valorian commander laughed. The sound came through the speakers like grinding metal, and the Valorian said that humans were even more foolish than he had thought. 5 ships against 30 was not a battle, but a massacre. He told Daniel to run back to Earth while he still could, or stay and die with the colonists. The choice was his. Daniel looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. He saw determination and fear and trust in their eyes. These people had followed him across the galaxy, and now they were about to follow him into a fight they could not win. But sometimes the fight mattered more than the odds. He gave the order to attack, and the Vanguard surged forward with its weapons coming online, and behind it the other 4 human ships moved into formation. The Battle of New Terra had begun. The Valorian fleet moved into attack formation, and Captain Daniel Harper watched from the bridge of the Vanguard as 30 enemy warships began their approach toward New Terra. The odds were overwhelming, and every tactical simulation his computer ran showed the same result. 5 human ships could not defeat 30 Valorian vessels in conventional combat. But Daniel had no intention of fighting conventionally. Lieutenant Jake Morris reported that the other 4 human ships were in position and ready to follow the Vanguard's lead. Commander Sophie Turner sent a message from the surface saying that ground defenses were active and the colonists were being moved to underground shelters. She also made it clear that her forces would not surrender no matter what happened in orbit. Daniel felt a surge of pride knowing that humans, both in space and on the ground, were ready to fight for what they had built. The Valorian commander sent one final message demanding surrender, and Daniel ignored it. Instead, he ordered his helmsman to execute the first maneuver, and the Vanguard suddenly accelerated directly toward the center of the Valorian formation. The Valorians had expected the humans to maintain a defensive position around the planet, but Daniel was doing the opposite. He was attacking. The Valorian ships opened fire and dozens of missiles streaked across the void toward the vanguard. This was standard Council tactics, and it was exactly what Daniel had prepared for. Lieutenant Chris Wade activated the electromagnetic pulse barriers and invisible fields of energy, spread out from the human ships. When the missiles hit the barriers, they detonated prematurely and their explosions lit up space but caused no damage to the vanguard. The Valorians seemed confused by this, and they closed their formation to prepare for a second missile volley. That was their first mistake. Daniel gave the order and the vanguard activated its independent jump drive. For a brief moment the ship seemed to fold in on itself, and then it vanished from where it had been and reappeared 300 kilometers away, on the opposite side of the Valorian fleet. The 4 other human ships did the same thing, and suddenly the Valorians found themselves surrounded. The Valorian commander shouted orders, and his fleet began to turn, but human weapons were already firing. The Vanguard's main cannons used focused energy beams developed from the same technology as the Nexus defense satellites. The beams cut through Valorian shields like they did not exist, and the first enemy ship exploded in a brilliant flash. 2 more Valorian vessels took critical hits before they could even bring their own weapons to bear. Daniel could hear Lieutenant Chris Wade calling out targets and coordinating fire with the other human ships. Engineer Maya Scott kept the power flowing to weapons and engines simultaneously, and her voice remained calm even as the ship shook from near misses. The bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, and everyone knew their role perfectly. The Valorians finally got organized and returned fire, but the human ships were already moving again. Another series of micro-jumps scattered the human vessels across the battlefield, and they appeared in positions that gave them clear firing solutions while making it difficult for the Valorians to coordinate their response. This was the advantage of the independent drive system. The humans could be anywhere at any moment while the Valorians were locked into predictable movement patterns. 3 more Valorian ships were destroyed and 2 others were badly damaged and drifting. The Valorian commander was screaming orders, but his fleet was in chaos. They had trained to fight enemies that followed Council doctrine, but the humans were doing everything wrong according to that doctrine. The humans jumped without gates and ignored established engagement ranges, and used weapons that should not have been able to penetrate modern shields. On the surface of New Terra, Commander Sophie Turner watched the battle through her sensors and allowed herself a moment of hope. The ground installations opened fire on Valorian ships that came within range, and kinetic accelerator weapons sent solid projectiles streaking into space at incredible velocities. These weapons had been banned by the Council decades ago because they were considered too crude, but that also meant Valorian shields were not designed to stop them. 2 damaged Valorian vessels took hits from ground fire and were completely destroyed. The battle entered its second hour, and the Valorians were now down to 23 operational ships. They tried to regroup and form a tighter defensive formation, but Daniel did not give them time. The vanguard jumped again, and this time it appeared directly above a cluster of 3 Valorian vessels. At point-blank range, the human weapons were devastating, and all 3 ships were crippled within seconds. Valorians attempted to retreat, but Daniel had positioned his other ships to cut off their escape routes. Every time a Valorian vessel tried to run, it found itself facing human weapons. Lieutenant Jake Morris had managed to hack into Valorian communications, and he was feeding Daniel real-time information about enemy command decisions. The humans knew what the Valorians were planning before they could execute their plans. Engineer Maya Scott reported that the Vanguard's power systems were running at 90% capacity and holding steady. The new reactors were performing better than expected even under combat conditions. She had made dozens of adjustments on the fly to optimize energy distribution, and her expertise was keeping the ship in the fight. By the 3rd hour, 15 Valorian ships had been destroyed and 8 more were too damaged to continue fighting. The remaining 7 vessels finally broke formation and fled at maximum speed. Daniel considered pursuing them but decided against it. He had made his point, and there was no need for additional bloodshed. He let them go and ordered his ships to secure orbit around New Terra. The bridge crew erupted in cheers, and Daniel allowed himself a smile. They had won a battle that everyone said was impossible. 5 ships against 30, and humanity had not lost a single vessel. Lieutenant Chris Wade was already compiling battle data to send back to Admiral Claire Johnson. The tactics they had used here would become standard doctrine for human forces. Commander Sophie Turner contacted the Vanguard from the surface, and her voice was filled with emotion. The colonists had watched the battle from their shelters, and now they were emerging to celebrate. New Terra was safe, and humanity had proven that it could defend its territory against anyone who challenged it. Daniel told her that the victory belonged to everyone who had refused to give up on this world. The Vanguard's sensors detected incoming ships, and for a moment Daniel tensed, before realizing they were human reinforcements. Admiral Claire Johnson had sent additional vessels as soon as she heard about the Valorian attack. The reinforcements were not needed for the battle, but they would help secure the system and repair any damage. Daniel welcomed them and began coordinating the cleanup operations. Lieutenant Jake Morris received a priority message from Earth and patched it through to Daniel. President Karen Phillips appeared on the screen and congratulated him on the victory. She told him that recordings of the battle were being sent to every corner of the galaxy. The Council needed to see what happened when they underestimated humanity. She also informed him that diplomatic channels were exploding with messages and that species from all over were reaching out to Earth. Daniel understood the implications immediately. This battle was not just about defending New Terra. It was about sending a message to the entire galaxy that humanity would not be pushed around anymore. The Council had believed that superior numbers guaranteed victory, but humans had proven that innovation and determination could overcome raw power. Every species that had ever felt oppressed by the Council was now looking at Earth with new eyes. Over the next few days, the recordings of the battle of New Terra spread across galactic networks, and the reaction was explosive. Some species praised humanity's courage, while others expressed shock at the brutality of human tactics. The Valorians demanded that the Council condemn Earth for using banned weapons, but that argument fell flat when others pointed out that humanity was no longer bound by Council regulations. Engineer Maya Scott and her team were already working on improvements to the ship's systems based on combat experience. She had identified several areas where efficiency could be increased, and she was eager to test new configurations. The human approach to technology was fundamentally different from the Council's. Where Council species followed established patterns, humans constantly experimented and adapted. Commander Sophie Turner began fortifying New Terra's defenses even further. She knew the Valorians might return with a larger force, and she wanted to be ready. But she also knew that the psychological impact of the battle was just as important as the physical defenses. The colonists had seen that Earth would fight for them, and that knowledge made them more determined than ever to build their world. Captain Daniel Harper sat in his quarters and wrote his official report on the battle. He tried to be objective and factual, but he could not help feeling a sense of pride in what his crew had accomplished. They had faced impossible odds and won because they refused to accept that losing was inevitable. That attitude was spreading throughout human space, and it was changing everything. The Galaxy Council would have to respond to this defeat somehow, and Daniel knew the next few months would be critical. Would the Council accept that humanity was now a power that had to be respected, or would they escalate the conflict? Either way, Daniel and his crew would be ready. They had proven that humans could fight and win, and that knowledge would carry them through whatever came. Next, the recording of the Battle of New Terra reached the Galaxy Council 3 days after the last Valorian ship had limped away from human space, and the effect was immediate. Council representatives who had dismissed humanity as insignificant suddenly found themselves watching footage of 5 human vessels destroying 15 Valorian warships and forcing the rest to retreat. The tactical displays showed maneuvers that should have been impossible, and weapons that cut through Valorian shields like they were nothing. Some Council members watched the recording in silence, while others began shouting demands for explanations. Ambassador Richard Hayes received over 200 communication requests in the first week after the battle, and he ignored most of them. He was no longer Earth's representative to the Council because Earth was no longer part of the Council. Instead, he now operated from an independent space station that humans had constructed in neutral territory. The station was called Freedom Point, and it served as humanity's diplomatic hub for dealing with the rest of the galaxy. From his office, Richard could see dozens of ships from different species waiting to dock and request meetings with human representatives. President Karen Phillips sat in her office in Geneva and watched reports coming in from across human space. The victory at New Terra had energized people in ways she had not anticipated. Recruitment for the defense forces had tripled, and volunteers were lining up to join colony expeditions to new worlds. Human corporations were reporting record profits as demand for human goods continued to climb. The galaxy had thought the embargo would destroy Earth, but instead it had made humanity stronger and more unified than ever before. The most surprising development came from within the Galaxy Council itself. 12 species had formally withdrawn from the Council in the month following the Battle of New Terra, and each one cited the same reasons. They were tired of being treated as inferior, and they were tired of watching the powerful species make all the decisions. The human example had shown them that leaving was possible, and that independence did not have to mean isolation. Representatives from these species had already reached out to Richard Hayes about joining something new. Richard called it the Free Worlds Coalition, and the basic principle was simple. Every member species had equal standing regardless of their military strength or economic power. Decisions were made by consensus rather than by the votes of a privileged few. Member species could govern themselves however they wanted as long as they respected the sovereignty of other members. There were no mandatory contributions and no restrictions on trade or expansion. It was everything the Galaxy Council was not. Admiral Claire Johnson stood in the shipyards orbiting Earth and watched as construction crews worked on the new generation of warships. The designs had been refined based on lessons learned at New Terra, and each new ship incorporated improvements that made them faster and more lethal than the Vanguard. But what made her most proud was the diversity of the workers. Humans labored alongside Kalari engineers and members of 3 other species who had joined the coalition. They shared knowledge freely and learned from each other, and the result was technology that surpassed anything a single species could have created alone. General Nathan Price was establishing joint military academies on Earth and New Terra, where officers from different coalition species trained together. The curriculum focused on flexibility and innovation rather than rigid doctrine. Human instructors taught tactics based on quick thinking and adaptation, while instructors from other species shared their own expertise. Price had realized something important during the Battle of New Terra. The Council militaries were powerful, but they were predictable because they all followed the same basic strategies. The coalition would succeed by being unpredictable and by constantly evolving. Back on the Galaxy Council station, the emergency session had been going for weeks without resolution. The Council was deeply divided between those who wanted to reform and those who wanted to crush the human rebellion by force. The moderate faction argued that the old system was clearly broken and that the Council needed to change if it wanted to survive. They proposed eliminating the hierarchy that gave some species more power than others and ending policies that discriminated against younger civilizations. The hardline faction led by the Valorians and their allies called for immediate military action. They argued that if the Council did not respond with overwhelming force, then more species would leave, and the entire galactic order would collapse. They pointed to the 12 species that had already withdrawn as proof that the situation was getting worse. The Valorian representative demanded that the Council authorize a joint military operation to retake New Terra and force Earth to accept Council authority, but the vote kept being delayed because too many Council members were afraid. The Battle of New Terra had proven that humans were not the easy target everyone had assumed. If the Council attacked Earth and lost, then the Council's credibility would be destroyed forever. And if they attacked and won but suffered heavy casualties, then other species might decide the Council was weakening. Either outcome would be dangerous, and so the debate continued while nothing was decided. Marcus Lee stood in his laboratory and examined the prototype of the newest innovation his team had created. The ship drives that had freed humanity from dependence on jump gates were already being improved, and the next generation would be even faster and more efficient. But Marcus was also working on something else that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. His team had figured out how to miniaturize the defensive technology used in the Nexus satellite network. Soon individual ships would be able to carry weapons that could challenge even the largest council, dreadnoughts. Captain Daniel Harper walked through the corridors of the Vanguard, and his crew greeted him with respect that bordered on reverence. He had become a hero to humanity and to many species in the coalition. Stories of the battle were told and retold, and each version made the victory seem even more impossible. Daniel tried not to let the attention change him, but he understood why it mattered. People needed heroes, and they needed to believe that courage and determination could overcome superior numbers. Commander Sophie Turner had been promoted to general and given command of all coalition ground forces. She was building an army that combined human infantry tactics with alien technologies, and the result was a fighting force unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Her soldiers trained in mixed units where humans worked alongside aliens, and everyone learned to cover each other's weaknesses. Turner believed that the coalition's greatest strength was not its technology, but its willingness to work together as equals. Richard Hayes sat down to compose a message to the Galaxy Council, and he knew this might be the last communication between humanity and the institution that had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. He made it clear that the Free Worlds Coalition was not seeking conflict with the Council. Humanity and its allies simply wanted to be left alone to govern themselves and trade freely. If the Council could accept that, then peace was possible. If not, then the coalition was prepared to defend itself. The message included an offer that Richard knew would be controversial. The coalition was willing to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Council as one sovereign entity to another. They could negotiate trade agreements and mutual defense pacts and work together on issues that affected the entire galaxy, but the relationship would be between equals, and humanity would never again accept being treated as inferior. The message was sent, and Richard waited for a response that might never come. He looked out the window of Freedom Point and saw ships from a dozen different species moving peacefully through space. This was what the galaxy could be if everyone was willing to let go of old prejudices and outdated power structures. The Council had a choice to make, and Richard hoped they would choose wisely. President Karen Phillips gave another speech, and this one was broadcast not just to humans, but to billions of beings across the galaxy. She talked about the values that had driven humanity to leave the Council and build something new. She spoke of dignity and freedom and the right of every species to determine its own future. She acknowledged that the path ahead would not be easy, and that there would be challenges and conflicts, but she also expressed hope that the galaxy was entering a new era where cooperation replaced domination. The speech resonated with people across thousands of worlds, and the coalition received hundreds of inquiries from species asking about membership. Some were small colonies with only a few million inhabitants, while others were established civilizations with their own fleets and economies. Each one was tired of the old system, and each one saw in the coalition a chance for something better. The Galaxy Council finally reached a decision after 6 weeks of debate, and the announcement shocked everyone. The Council would not attack Earth, but it would also not recognize the legitimacy of the Free Worlds Coalition. Any species that left the Council would be considered in breach of their agreements and subject to sanctions. The Council would begin a program of internal reforms, but these would be implemented gradually over decades rather than immediately. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and changed very little. Richard Hayes read the Council's statement and smiled. They still did not understand. The galaxy had already changed, and no amount of denial would make the old order return. The Free Worlds Coalition was growing stronger every day, and more species were joining. The Council could try to resist, but they were fighting against an idea, and ideas were harder to defeat than warships. Earth had not just left the Galaxy Council. Humanity had shown the entire universe that there was another way to organize civilization. They had proven that courage and innovation could overcome entrenched power, and that small groups working together could accomplish what large bureaucracies could not. The old powers were in a state of panic because they finally understood that their time was ending, and they did not know how to stop it.